All right, it's good to see everyone. I have been posting on YouTube mini lectures. I've been saving them for my students here on Patreon or are here at the college. But I thought I'll probably post this one. The world could use more Emily Dickinson, so I'll upload that after this. There's always three different kinds of readers of Dickinson when I teach. There's usually those who have been reading Dickinson at least since high school and they love Dickinson. There are those who are reading them for the first time for the class and who immediately find a lifelong companion in her works. And then there's the third category of the people who find her absolutely frustrating. Why can't the poet just say what she wants to say? Why does she have to be so riddling about it, so cryptic? It's kind of lazy, isn't it lazy to have the poet write these words and then ask us to make sense of it? It's putting so much work on the reader. Why can't the poet do it herself? It's demanding too much. We're going to talk about that. But I hope to show you in this lecture that the way Dickinson uses the lyric is nothing short of genius. In fact, it's pretty miraculous. There's nothing like it. So how should you read her? We learned last week, I had the lecture on Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads. We talked about the meddling intellect, where Wordsworth has that poem, Tables Turned. He talks about the meddling intellect that murders to dissect. It's a very masculine, kind of analytical approach to understanding poetry. There's nothing that'll kill these poems faster than a meddling intellect. And you try to squeeze the meaning out of them. They're like little stones, these poems. They're so lapidary and bead-like. And you try to press the meaning and suddenly the bead will eject and fly across the room and you'll miss it and your fingers will be aching and you'll just be super frustrated. But if you hold the poem in your hand the way a child holds a ladybug, its children have such innate reverence for ladybugs for some reason. I've never seen a child kill a ladybug. They always hold them with just kind of this wonder in their hands. If you cradle the poem that way and you just let it be and you stare at it long enough, you'll see yourself in your own world reflected on the glossy surface. Because it is glossy, there's no hard edge upon which the intellect may pick, really. There are entrances into the poem, we'll talk about that, but there's something that just demands a kind of reverence, kind of intuition. I'm going to show you my slides here. She has this really great poem. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say, it just begins to live that day. I was reading one critic's commentary, an early 20th century critic who said that this was banal. And I think that was an absolutely stupid comment to make. And I know that none of us think that this is banal. In fact, it's really profound. And in a way, she's giving us the principle for poetics here. That the poems have a certain life to them. In fact, when she writes to Higginson for the first time, she sends some poems and she says, by the way, Thomas Wentworth Higginson was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly here in Boston. Dickinson sent some poems to him. She respected his writings, wanted to know if her poems were alive, whether they live. So you'll never master the poems with comprehension, but you can touch them with apprehension, with this point of contact, because the poems are grounds for an encounter. This is true for most lyric poetry. How does this work? As I know you all know, I've had this slide before on Patreon, but it's a wonderful quotation by Helen Bindler, who was teaching here at Harvard back not too long ago, and she recently passed away. And she gave this interview for the Harvard Gazette, in which she has this wonderful quotation, which I think is a great guiding light for us. She says, "I don't think poems have much to do with ideas. Philosophy may, but poetry doesn't. In any case, when poets employ ideas, they use them as raw material subject to the laws of form like any other ingredient. No philosopher would be satisfied with a poetic treatment of any ideas, yet poems are usually taught mistakenly as embodiments of ideas rather than enactments of consciousness. Notice the vitality there in the antithesis, embodiments of ideas. We're not just clothing ideas to communicate a notion or a concept or any other kind of idea. It's enactment of mobile consciousness. The activity of the lyric is something really important to how we should read it. So don't expect these poems to behave like prose. That's the rule here. Prose logic does not work with Emily Dickinson. You should read them as though they're coming alive on the page as you're reading them, as though perhaps they're your own voice. Um, and sometimes they are your own voice. I mean, there are parts of yourself. You know, it's interesting. You can dream and be surprised in your dream. And you think, how can that possibly? It's my own mind. How can I be surprised in dreams? Well, there are parts of you that, if they were to speak to you, you would have a hard time understanding them, but it would still be you. There's this otherness to you, and sometimes the poems are this voice coming from the same place. Now, the way I've structured this lecture is partly biographical. We're going to be looking at Dickinson herself with her poems. And I think with a poet like Dickinson, you just really can't separate the poems from her consciousness. This is something that I've been talking about with you all in the book club. Shivani's brought this up, just this idea that in a way they're inextricable. And I want to clarify what I mean here because Dickinson in her letters makes it very clear sometimes. She doesn't want us to think that the lyrical I is her. She calls it a supposed self. And we can say, okay, we'll separate the two. Not every poem is autobiographical. Sometimes she's imagining, sometimes the death of a soldier, sometimes a love affair, which may or may not have happened, but they're coming from her. And I think this is really important for Dickinson, or her poetry. She has this line, and she has a couple lines where the blending between reality and fiction and imagination almost become reality. Here's a quatrain from one of her poems. The vision, pondered long, so plausible becomes that I esteem the fiction real. The real fictitious seems. It's though the imagination is actually having an experience in these vicarious experiences that it has it through the imagination. And it's in that sense we can think about Dickinson alongside her poetry. You know, a poet about 400 years ago described his little book of poems as sparking flint. He used the Latin, but the image comes from the blacksmith shop, the forge. You heat up the iron, you place it on the anvil, and you hammer it into shape. And as it's being shaped, the sparks fly. And these little sparks of scintillating light, I think, are the poems in the forge of her mind. It catches fire. So, a little bit of context for Emily Dickinson. Dickinson begins writing in what was often called the American Renaissance. F.O. Matheson places this within a 5-year window. That was when he was writing in the 40s. Critics now place it a couple decades in the mid-19th century. It was when Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau were writing, Margaret Fuller, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, John Greenleaf Whittier. All of these great American 19th century poets were alive and writing during the mid-19th century. But up to that point, what really creates this American Renaissance is an anxiety. It's the anxiety that America does not have its own voice. There's no distinct American voice. Emerson says in The Poet, written in 1844, speaking of the American poet to come, I look in vain for the poet whom I describe. we do not with sufficient plainness or sufficient profoundness address ourselves to life, nor dare we chaunt our own times and circumstances. The complaint is that the Americans are still modeling their content and their verse on the continent, on England, from England. They don't have their own identity, and they're not singing about their own national identity with plainness or profoundness. Margaret Fuller, another great essayist, 2 years after this was published, she writes an essay called American Literature, Its Position in the Present Time. She says the same thing about the American poet. That such a genius is to rise and work in this hemisphere, we are confident. Equally so, that scarce the first faint streaks of that day's dawn are yet visible. It is sad for those that foresee to know that they may not live to share its glories. Yet it is sweet, too, to know that every act and word uttered in light of that foresight may tend to hasten or ennoble its fulfillment. Emerson was writing poetry. Thoreau wrote poetry. Melville wrote poetry. We know them for their prose. When Whitman writes his 1855 Leaves of Grass in the preface, he borrows the language from Fuller and Emerson to say, "Here I am. I'm the American poet." I think Whitman is grand, but I don't think he's quite profound. I don't, in the sense of sufficient profoundness. I don't think he has a certain sufficient plainness either. And it's interesting that while all these writers were writing, people were looking on the horizon for the American poet and when he would come. And they did think it would be a he. In the quiet town of Hampshire County, Massachusetts, in a small room beside a tiny desk overlooking the street from a second-story window, there was Emily Dickinson writing hundreds and hundreds of poems, most of which would not see the light of day until the 1890s. Only a handful were published in her lifetime, and all anonymously. Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, 1830. Much of her life was spent privately, at home. She seldom left her family home in her later years and avoided engagement with the outside world. She was a profound letter writer. She was a great letter writer. She loved reading letters and writing them. And you get a sense of this in her correspondence. She sent a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson in 1862, and they developed correspondence. Higginson realized that she was something special. He was dealing with a genius here. He was asking for poems, begging to publish them, and she wouldn't let him. She wrote almost 1,800 poems. Most of them are highly compressed. You look through a volume, whether you have Franklin or the Johnson edition, and they're all highly compressed, concise, even almost disjointed, and they explore these themes of introspection, of immortality, of death, of pain and grief. She's really great on these subjects, all the subjects that poets love, but she does it so well in her own way. And even love. She did have a love life. She loved at least 4 people, critics think. Yeah. Let me show you a picture of her childhood, from her childhood here. There she is with her siblings, the older brother, Austin, there in the middle. Lavinia, sometimes affectionately called Vinny, there to the right. And there's, of course, Emily on the left. How do we know it's Emily? She's holding a flower and a book of, it looks like a herbarium, a book of flowers and a real flower. I find this kind of prophetic, that there's a real flower and a depiction of a flower there, because the poems aren't the things on the page, but what exists between the mind and the page. And it's though there's the reality right above, floating above the depiction of the flower. Of course, she would refer to her own poems as flowers sometimes, or wings. The word anthology comes from the Greek anthos logi, a collection of flowers. You think of a poetry anthology, it makes the metaphor just perfect. But there she is in a younger age. Probably what she wanted you to know most, what she would have wanted you to know most about her, first about her, was the fact that she loved flowers. And you all, having read her poems, already know this. She would sometimes walk 20 miles in the woods as a girl, teenager. 20 miles in the woods around Amherst and in the fields looking for flowers. Her poems are filled with them, the things of the woods that make up those images and metaphors of her poem. You might remember that beautiful one we read, "The gentian weaves her fringes." It's one of the more dramatic poems. It casts the departure of summer as a funeral procession. The gentian weaves her fringes, the maple's loom is red. My departing blossoms obviate parade. They're just that first stanza there. Since you've read it before, I don't feel too bad about cutting it up this way with commentary. But the gentian appears a lot in the poems. It's a blue flower that bloomed in autumn. And there's something she loved about the beauty blooming during the season of death, I think. And the gentian is weaving, preparing for something, weaving her fringes. Maple's loom is red, domestic scene here of perhaps preparation or making something. And we know we're in the season of autumn. My departing blossoms obviate parade. I think she casts herself within this domestic scene, the speaker does, talking of her blossoms, which I think perhaps suggest her poems, at least suggest the poems, which certainly do obviate parade. They don't flout. There's something kind of discreet and a little demure about her poetry. We might even say apparently demure, because they've got some teeth to them. But then, so you have this domestic scene, this private scene of preparation, and then this public procession by the interval. Always notice the spaces where the intervals come in here. Sometimes they operate as a hinge, separate certain ideas, set apart quatrains. They operate differently in the poem sometimes. Change of scene. A brief but patient illness, an hour to prepare, and one below this morning is where the angels are. It was a short procession. The bobolink was there. An aged bee addressed us. Then we knelt in prayer. We trust that she was willing. We ask that we may be. Summer, sister, seraph, let us go with thee. There's this beautiful use of dashes at the end of the line. The dashes are doing different things in different poems. Sometimes they connect. Sometimes they enact the thinking or a space where she's saying, not quite done. Here, I think it's working here to connect the lines so that the lines aren't just enjambed, but they're kind of connected, strung along, almost on a necklace. It's where the angels are. It was a short procession. And then notice when we get down here, this ambiguity with the dash, the absence of the dash. We trust that she was willing. We ask that we may be. Summer, sister, seraph, let us go with thee. And it's this line here that I want to draw our attention to, the absence of the dash here, which in a way is its own form of punctuation, because there are two ways that you could read this. I think a more correct way, but a possibility that's certainly not precluded from the grammar here. So the first one is, we ask that we may be what? Willing. We ask that we may be willing like summer was. Willing to depart. And there's this other sense where if you're reading it for the first time, you might think, we ask that we may be summer, sister, seraph. In a way, that's not wrong. And so you see how, where Wordsworth, we saw a couple weeks ago, uses enjambment to make multiple meanings, so is Dickinson using this as a way to heighten the ambiguity. And this is something very important to her poetics. The dashes are used by no external law, but an internal principle. You just have to kind of catch the sense of the poem, and the dashes make sense. And then we have this really audacious for the 19th century reimagining of the Christian baptismal formula. And we have the introduction of a new Trinitarian blessing. one of my students was very uncomfortable with this. She called it radical. In the name of the bee and of the butterfly and of the breeze. Amen. She always did find more solace in the woods and fields than in church. Her spiritual sensitivity was invigorated by the natural world. So here she is with one of those flowers as a little girl. What was her relationship with her family like? She was always close to her siblings. Um, Her father, they had a great relationship. In fact, it was from him that she read so much, reading the books in his library. He purchased the latest novels from England. So Dickinson was reading Charles Dickens. She was reading George Eliot, the Browning poets. Her father recognized that she was incredibly intelligent. She was signing as a legal witness to his documents at age 11, which knew she understood what was going on. Austen wasn't. And he was the one to kind of inherit follow in his father's footsteps, I should say. So this is really interesting. She's precocious, and her family recognizes this. Vinnie was always a great and caring sister. One biographer said that Vinnie held back the world while Dickinson confronted eternity. So their house that they lived in was the center of town. People were always coming in and out. Her father was a trustee of the college, so commencement actually happened on the grounds. He was the head lawyer for the town. Ministers, doctors, lawyers, they all came to the Dickinson house, and the sisters were having to run it, help run it. Her relationship with her mother, it seems, it wasn't toxic, you might say, but it just was not a great relationship. Her mother was very busy, distant. We get the impression from Emily that she didn't much care for thoughts. Um, and so Emily just didn't have a great relationship with her mother. It wasn't hostile, but there was just not a very intimate connection. There's actually a third sibling to Dickinson here that's not figured, and that's Sue Gilbert, her friend, girl about her age that she met at Amherst Academy when they were girls together. Sue and her had a very intense relationship. Sue would go on to marry Austen, Emily's older brother, yet they had a passionate love for each other. If you read the letters, the portions that were not erased by the family after Emily's death, you'll find that they are somewhat erotic and passionate, very intimate. And you may think, oh, well, that's the way friendships were back then. I understand that's possible, but once you read the letters, you think, no, I think there's something going on here. And that love endured even after she married Austen. So it was interesting. She lived next door. Austen, her older brother, and Sue Gilbert Dickinson, later after she married, were living just across the yard. So, and yes, they were sending letters back and forth. Let me show you Emily when she was around 16 or 17. This is the only confirmed picture, photograph we have of her. This was taken at Mount Holyoke, December 1846, maybe 1847. She's 16 or 17. She has her mother's eyes, far set apart, piercing, cutting a small figure at the desk. This is before she became reclusive. You see that she insisted on being photographed with a flower in her hand. And there at the desk is a Bible. There she is holding a sprig. It's funny the way she described herself to Higginson. Higginson, who I said was very interested in her as a person and in her poetry, he asked, it's kind of funny, he's like, do you have a photograph of yourself that I could have? And she writes back, she says, I had no portrait now, but am small like the wren. And my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guests leave behind. It's a really telling self-description, funny in a way, self-deprecating, I think. She was tiny. I went to I went to the Emily Dickinson house in Amherst, and they have her shift here in the Houghton. She's even shorter than I am, which I know means nothing over Zoom, but her top of her head was maybe right about here, a little over 5 feet, I think, something like that. She was very small. And the chestnut burr, by the way, is, if you've ever seen one, it's like this crazy tree nut with like weird wire hair. It's kind of crazy. The hair is everywhere, so it's not flattering. But her hair was red, and she was freckled. But the way she describes her eyes, like the color of the sherry leftovers in the glass. It's really interesting. Higginson would make the visit to see her in Amherst, actually. And on one of those visits, he said, "Gosh, I'm so glad." He wrote this down afterwards. He didn't tell her this. "I'm so glad she doesn't live near me because my energy is completely drained." There was something about her. He described her physically as looking like an Undine or a Thekla, which is an otherworldly creature. Undine was a German water spirit. Friedrich de la Motte had a really nice 19th century fairy tale about an Undine, this girl who shows up at a fisherman's cottage, and otherworldly. But Saint Thecla was a first century martyr, a woman who performed the duties usually relegated to men. She preached and baptized as a woman. It was interesting he would make this connection between the two in his comparison. Otherworldly and this feminist, visionary, we might say. So let me talk a little bit about her education. She was learned. She wasn't just smart, she was learned. At the Amherst Academy, she would have been able to sit in on the lectures at the college with men. Um, the college was not over a decade older than she was, and her father was one of the helpers who started it. It was actually started in response to Harvard's liberalism. There were a lot of Western towns that founded colleges in response to Harvard's wayward Unitarian leanings. And so this was a good Calvinist Congregationalist endeavor. We're going to bring orthodoxy back to the academy. We're going to start the college. And she went there, and part of what Amherst College wanted to do was be just as good as any of the East Coast schools. So they brought in the best scientists, the best geologists, the best zoologists, the botanists, geometrists even. And she went to these lectures and took copious notes, we would imagine, because she absorbs this. The architecture of her metaphors are geometric, they're geological, talking about the volcanoes and strata. She says she studied mental philosophy along with Latin. She studied a bit of German as well. You see this interest in science in her poetry. Instead of using the poetic mind, she'll often say brain, which is a very scientific way of describing the body's thinking organ. And here we have this poem here that we read before. Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. I love just the way it looks on page. This highly compressed, it's like a pressure cooker, this thing. It's just intense distillation. She said, she told Higginson once that she wrote in a letter, "When I try to organize, my little force explodes." And it's almost what this poem does. It looks like I don't know if you've ever seen a chrysanthemum around this time of year where it's just a bulb and it's just a plant with all those little bulbs, like a little flower fist. And then all of a sudden, when the sun shines on it in autumn, it turns into a flower, goes out in all directions. These little poems are like that. They look like these little lapidary beads on a page, and then when you read them, they go in all directions and just kind of spread out. This is the way it is with her. Faith, a fine invention. Notice the interconnection of sound. Vention, gentleman, the F. The long vowels, the E sound, the I sound. Highly compressed, highly disjuncted, but coherent. It's this lapidary compression that I think enables the extreme concision, the gathering of the world about it. And it's a good example, this poem, how Dickinson will use certain typographical features to point to certain words. You'll notice she has faith in quotation marks. C is italicized. Gentleman is capitalized. So is microscopes, which is also italicized. And emergency is capitalized. What's going on here? You kind of just have to intuit what's going on here. I can't close read this the way I do other things. This frustrates that sort of inquiry. But you can catch the senses. See and microscopes are linked. Scopos, seeing, it's an activity. It's also a little gendered with gentlemen can see. I mean, the poem, it kind of highlights the instability of faith, or at least pokes fun at a certain conventional religious faith. This insufficiency is sort of questioned, or that maybe faith is on a spectrum, science and belief, perhaps. A little clue about this is she sent it to Samuel Bowles, the editor of the Springfield Republican. And it's funny because Samuel Bowles was writing letters to Austin and Sue across the yard. And in his letters to them, he often uses the word faith. He's talking about it a lot. And so some critics speculate that, well, perhaps Dickinson was reading some of those letters and this is a response. Perhaps. But I think what her scientific education gives us, which is just most magical, is her scientific eye. And this is just a great example of the scientific, meticulous infusion of observation with intimacy and affection. And we've all seen this certain slant of light around this time of year. I just saw it actually on the walk back over here to my office, and the shadows were lengthened. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference, where the meanings are. None may teach it any, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. I read that and I go, how does she do that? I don't know what she's done. I don't know how to describe it, but it's some kind of poetic wizardry here. She balances beautifully this photographic detail of the world of things, and like an impressionist painter, she doesn't merely give us a documentary description, but an emotional portrait of the scene. We get the sense that this certain slant of light is not the light that is out there existing apart from us or her. It is the certain slant of light as it is received within the mind, as we see it with our eyes, as we trace over it with our memories and feel it in our hearts. It's the perfect blend of the inner and outer worlds of things and thought. Charles Taylor recently published a book, Cosmic Connections, this year, actually, and he talks about the interspace, this space between the poem and the mind. And he suggests, I think, that the real poem is that which exists when we're reading it. It's almost like the certain slant of light, too, that really exists is the one that is experienced in this poem. It's just a different way of knowing, a different way of moving about in the world and processing knowledge, of representing experience. Now, when we were looking at Coleridge and Wordsworth, I said that I quoted Napoleon, even though I don't care much for Napoleon. He had something really good to say. He said, to understand a man, you must see what was going on in the world in his 20s. And this is true for Dickinson. What was going on in her world in her teens and 20s. Now, her world that she was born into was already it was already Calvinist, highly religious in this way. So Calvinism, 19th century American Calvinism in New England at this time meant, among other things, that you believed that God had predestined people's souls before they were born to go to heaven or not. That was one feature of it. Another is total depravity, the belief that human nature is totally corrupted by sin as a result of the fall. Other aspects are the supremacy of the Bible as the source of truth. There were other things as well. They didn't really celebrate holidays like we do today. It wasn't until the Episcopal Church came to Amherst in 1864 that Easter and Christmas really caught on in the way that we celebrate it today. So it was different. So that's the world she was born into. But when she was growing up, when she was coming of age, a religious movement had hit the town. And when I say hit, it's probably not the right metaphor. This religious movement, this evangelical revival, swallowed every single entity in this town. Every institution, the academy, the college, Mount Holyoke Seminary, her family, her friends, even Emily Dickinson herself, although this revival could not digest her and spit her out. She was alone, essentially, and it took some processing there. So the characteristics of this revival is really fascinating. There was a wave of church memberships. The First Congregationalist Church in Amherst, where her father and family went, saw an intake of 68 new church memberships. And one of them was Little Sue Gilbert. She made a profession of faith and she joined the church. Edward Dickinson, her father, even knuckles under and joins the church. Emily is the only one to never become a church member of her family. She attended Mount Holyoke Seminary, and she wanted to. It was wonderful. It was progressive. This is women's education. It was a great school, had an excellent curriculum. She wanted to go. She goes in, and we would probably describe it as a cult in the 21st century. But this was just the water people swam in. The religious revival demanded that you had to have a personal, emotional encounter with Christ in order to be a Christian. And so the school was divided up into three classes of people. Girls who were professors, those who professed Christianity, those who were hopers, those who wanted to be Christian but were just waiting for Jesus to give them this emotional encounter and to make them Christian. And the professors had already gone through this. And then there were the no-hopers. And Dickinson was a no-hoper, a category of people who were described as being eternally lost, had no hope. How she got in this position, it's quite remarkable. One day, Miss Lyon, I think she was the headmistress of the school, came into the room. All the girls were seated. She said, "All those who want to be Christians, rise." Everyone rises, except Emily. There was something about the wording of that request that her conscience would not bow to. And this was really bad for her. Some of the teachers there, Miss Whitman, thought that she was rebellious. But everyone thought it was strange, she said, that I should be the only one not to rise. She said everyone thought it was queer, but she said, I thought a lie would be queerer. Can you imagine the integrity of a 16 to 17-year-old woman in that context to do that? The amount of integrity is just astounding to me. Friends asked her about this. She said, well, it's not that it's just that I don't have a desire to be a Christian. I want to be a Christian, she says other times, but I don't want to renounce the world. And you think, how much of the sinful world can a 16-year-old a Calvinist girl from Amherst really be giving up. But she couldn't do it. And sometimes it sounds like from her conversations and letters during this period, she wanted to have that experience, but Christ wouldn't give it to her. She thought she was abandoned by Christ. One by one, her friends, they get married, they make professions. She has one friend that goes to Syria as a missionary, and she is kind of left behind. And what I'm trying to drive home here is the isolation that this would have been, that this would have felt like to her. And you get a sense of loneliness in her poems, I think, this outsiderness. And she even plays with it and adopts it and wears the mantle herself, sometimes the outsider. But this is, I think, part of it. It was during this time, really formative time in her life. So you'll notice that a lot of her poems are framed as conversations with this new religious style, this new revival. And one was her great redefinition of Sabbath keeping. Let me pull that up. I love this. Love this poem. So great. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Notice the antithesis. You remember that poem I started with? Some say, I say. Some keep, I keep. She does this a lot. It's this kind of distinction she makes. Sabbath keeping, what was that? Well, for Calvinists, for the Puritans, for many Reformed folk today, Sunday, called the Christian Sabbath, is the day of no work, only for worship and rest. And so Christians in Amherst would go to church, they would go to prayer meetings, they'd go home, they read the Bible, they wouldn't read novels, they wouldn't do any work. You'd sit and think about death, your death, heaven and hell. Dickinson was doing that all her life anyway. But this is how you'd keep the Sabbath. In fact, when a young man from Newport, Rhode Island, visited Amherst in 1846, he was surprised to find that the people of Amherst took a stroll on Sabbath afternoons. He was kind of scandalized because apparently in Newport, Rhode Island, you didn't do that. You stayed at home or at church. Anyway, he came around. He kind of saw how, I guess you can think about God and walk at the same time. So this is what Sabbath keeping was. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings. And instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. I love that. Surprise. The surplice was like a vestment that a minister would wear. I just wear my wings. I think about those fascicles with which she bound up her poems. Looked like little folded pieces of papers, little booklets, little wings perhaps. And she did read George Herbert, so maybe she has Easter wings in mind here. I think she's talking about her poems, perhaps. Or maybe this is her as a little wren. So the sexton is a little bird. But the sexton actually, it's a metaphor for a bird, but the sexton is someone who keeps the graveyard, the churchyard. But here we're to understand the sexton as perhaps the bobolink or a wren. And I love what she's doing with the dash here, a little playful wink with this suspension. Our little sexton does what? Sings. God preaches a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along. Love that. Love that. That contrast between getting there and going. It's not out there, it's here. The idea of paradox, very important for Dickinson. There are a couple here. We might actually think of this more correctly as an antinomy, the accommodation of two apparently antithetical statements harmoniously in one thing. The first is that she doesn't transgress the Sabbath, she's saying. She keeps it. She claims to honor it, but in her own way. There's a certain sovereignty with Dickinson that she protects. There's a sanctity of her own agency, I think, that she's doing here. She plays the game, but she plays it her way. I keep the Sabbath, but I do it at home, which many in her context would say that's not keeping the Sabbath at all. Second paradox here is that she's playing with this feminine role while resisting the societal conventions. You know, Joe Small in a book, Positive as Sound, really nice book on Dickinson's poem, she mentions this about this poem. She says, on one hand, you've got the conventional role of the female poet who loves staying at home, sitting in her garden. But on the other hand, you've got Dickinson who is resisting the sentimental piety that was often associated with women at the time. So you've got yes and no. One last thing here she's doing with form is that she's writing in hymn meter. If you have a copy of Franklin or any copy of her poems, you flip through, you think, oh my word, it's all the same thing. Every poem looks the same. It's all in these common measure, this hymn measure. But they're so different. But what she's using is she's transforming not just the idea of religious convention, but the form itself. She repurposes the mode of poetry designed or accommodated for corporate public worship, and she transforms it into a private, individual devotional mode of lyric. And that's another way that she takes from the religious culture and she makes it her own. There's a certain constraint to antithesis. You know, if you want to reject something, you're still kind of bound to it in a way that you don't have the agency from. You know, Milton's Satan can only be what God is not. He can only react against. But that's not what Dickinson's doing. She's not completely rejecting. She's repurposing. She's making it new. Shivani says in the chat, natural piety. Yeah. Yeah. There's a theme here. Other facets of culture that she will repurpose are the signs of outward piety popular at the time. So one of those was the temperance movement. So the temperance movement started in the 19th century, early 19th century. It lasted really. We still have it some places. It's this movement associated with Protestant Christianity, which says no alcohol. Some forms just say no drunkenness. But there was a poem that she wrote that the temperance movement loved, and that was I Taste the Liquor Never Brewed, which actually has nothing to do with the temperance movement, but she's taking language from it to make her own statement. Let me just show you this poem. Love this one. This is another great one. Well, they all are, really. I taste a liquor never brewed, from tankards scooped in pearl. Not all the vats upon the rhyme yield such an alcohol. Inebriate of air am I, a debauchee of dew, reeling through endless summer days from inns of molten blue. When landlords turn the drunken bee out of the foxglove's door, when butterflies renounce their drams, I shall but drink the more. Till seraphs swing their snowy hats and saints to windows run, to see the little tippler leaning against the sun. When her poems were published, an English reviewer complained, "Pearl does not rhyme with alcohol." The English have always been dense first readers of American poetry, and who can blame them, really, because the likes of Whitman and Dickinson had never been seen before. But it brings an important point up about rhyme. Some of her rhymes are no rhymes at all. Some of them are just really off rhymes. Some are slant rhymes. Some are imperfect rhymes. But sometimes the rhymes, I think, resist the expectation of the hymn form, but also make a different kind of rhyme, a thought rhyme. linking certain sounds or half sounds together. Pearl, alcohol, for instance. Blue and dew, a perfect rhyme there. Door and more, another perfect rhyme. Run and sun, another perfect rhyme. Linking running and sunning, which makes a lot of sense. You might think of Andrew Marvell, and some others. It's what they do. But yeah. She said, by the way, this is so much like Whitman, or something that he had said once in his poem, Song of Myself. He says, I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. Dickinson told Higginson that she had never read Whitman. Perhaps that's true. Um, Perhaps they're both just coming from the same source here. There's something in the air with transcendentalism, this movement in Concord, which is not far. She read Emerson. She read some of the other transcendentalists, and it's not different from what Emerson says in his essay on the poet. So the principle here, before we get to Emerson, is just that intoxication off of nature. And Emerson does something really similar as well. That spirit which suffices quiet hearts, which seem to come forth to such from every dry knoll of sere grass, from every pine stump and half-embedded stone on which the dull March sun shines, comes forth to the poor and hungry, and such as are of simple taste. He's saying if you have simple taste, you'll be rich all around, and you'll be able to notice it, you'll be sensitive. And then he comes in with this very Puritan, convicting, homiletic thing where he says, if thou fill thy brain with Boston and New York, with fashion and covetousness, and wilt stimulate thy jaded senses with wine and French coffee, thou shalt find no radiance of wisdom in the lonely waste of the pine woods. Love that. And you think of, what are we stimulating our jaded senses with now? Short form media, reels, TikToks, all of this is just a simulation of experience, a simulation of pleasure, causing a kind of crust upon our souls, a callousness. And that there's something in the pine woods just as exciting if we could cultivate a certain sensitivity to it. Anyway, I think that's what I Tasted Liquor Never Brewed is really about. But there again, you see the paradox. She's equally temperate, equally intoxicated. She's caught both there. So now this next part of the lecture, I think, is probably the most important. So if you haven't been listening up until now, there's still hope. Dickinson writes in a feminist style, a feminine style. And our methods of analysis and appreciation is largely academic and masculine. And I'm using these categories, feminine and masculine, within the tradition of the Western tradition, especially within our own context of what the Western tradition thought of as masculine language and feminine language. When John Locke and Thomas Sprat in the late 17th century start developing a direct scientific language, they're developing what was called a masculine style. It was firm, it was monologic, it was exclusive in a way. It tried to hedge against any possible attacks, so it did not want ambiguity. It was direct. It was suspicious of metaphor and other forms of figurative language. And it was authoritative and firm. And the mode of relation in the language is agonistic and oppositional. Agonistic in the sense of Harold Bloom, who certainly was one of these critics who even more recently is very oppositional and agonistic. It's polemical. He wants to make a firm stance, strong stance. This is what masculine mind in the Western tradition does. Adam's first job in the garden in Genesis was to name things. He was into taxonomy. He wanted to go around and This is a bird, this is a mammal, this is a cow, and he's categorizing everything. Eve's, well, at least in Milton's, Eve, while Adam's out there naming things, she's there growing things. And so I think that this is a great kind of type for what I'm talking about here. However, feminine writing is dialogic, not monologic. It's inclusive. It accommodates ambiguity and possibility. It's highly figurative in the sense that one must relate to it not as though you're coming to it as a statement of faith or a credo or an argument, but as something to be intuited. It's dialectical. It's open and ongoing and candidly subject to revision. And they're great critics of both traditions. You know, Harold Bloom was very much agonistic and oppositional. Other folks were more, well, how did Helen Gardner describe it as the critics who hold the scepter and the critics who hold the torch. Harold Bloom was a scepter wielder. He reigned. He wanted to make affirmative statements. But there are other critics who just want to shine the light and say, look at this. Are you looking at it right? What if we move the light this way? What do you see? Um, you all know which one I value, but let me pull up a little bit of both are good at certain times, but I tend to go more towards the torch-bearing approach. Uh, yeah, here's where you can find a little bit more about what I'm talking about. Paul Crumbly, in his book Inflections of the Pen, The Dash in Voice, and Emily Dickinson, great book, he writes that Dickinson opposes the monologic exclusivity characteristic of patriarchal writing with her own dialogic and inclusive poetics. Bauer and McKinstry, in their book Feminism, Bakhtin, and the Dialogic, argue that a feminist dialogics is not agonistic or oppositional. It also suggests an identity and dialectical response always open and ongoing. Is there any better way to describe a Dickinson poem than open and ongoing? We're not studying fossils, we're studying plants. We're taking a walk in the woods. This is real living things, these poems. Here's another great poem. You all know I'm going here. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedar, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof the gambrels of the sky, of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. What's the contrast she's making? She always says, some people do this, I do this. There's always a hinge of contrast. Often, I should say. Prose, and on the other hand, we expect poetry, possibility, which is really the same thing for Dickinson's poetics. It's the metaphor of the house. Possibility is poetry. The windows, metaphors for places of vision, of ocular experience, of visionary capacity. Doors, people pass through, light passes through, air passes through. Charles Taylor, in an older book, Secular Age, talks about the buffered self and the porous self. He says the medieval porous self was not buffered and individualistic, but it was open. Things pass through. It's an open space. Notice too, this where I do think this is a gendered poetics thing here. Fairer house than prose. I was talking to my wife about this. She actually noticed this. She said, "Oh, the fairer sex." That's what people used to call. Used to be a euphemism for women, the fairer sex. So fair is a word that is associated with women, and so the house itself, I think, is a little gendered here. This house of poetry. It's a way of relating. Impregnable of eye and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Teresa de Avila, actually, an amazing female mystic, wrote a similar metaphor about the interior castle. So there's 7 layers of the house, and that the seventh was the deepest part of the soul. Dickinson, I don't think, read Diavola, but it's interesting. It's a fruitful comparison, I think. Now, of visitors, the fairest. Now, if we're going to take my thesis and apply it here, that this is talking about this sort of feminine mind, it doesn't mean that only women can read this. It means you have to leave that analytical stuff, the masculine mode of reading prose and looking for the meaning and just going straight for it as though this is some commercial transaction. You just want the goods. No, you must leave that at the door and also kind of make yourself poor. The fairest for occupation. This. And you think this, oh, for occupation, writing poetry, is opening up this celebration. And then the 2 lines go on and clarify thisness. The spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. And I do this with my hands, thinking too of her fascicles, which were woven together in a little booklet, which would have stood laid open on our hands like this. And notice the rhyme linking this with paradise. Of course, it doesn't really chime. It's not a perfect rhyme, but what's she doing? She's connecting the state of paradise with this, of what is now this. The urgency and the proximity of this demonstrative pronoun, and all of its urgency is just there. Now, let me show you what this poem looks like in the handwritten copy. Now, you should go to edickinson.org and look up your favorite poems there to see what they actually looked like. Because the editors, the Johnson and the Franklin, they had to make a decision. And you'll see in these little booklets, do you see that plus sign? That always indicates an alternative word, which you'll place at the bottom. So the gambrels of the sky here, but then what do you have down here? The gables, which gives you a completely different poem. It's just slightly different. And this is one of the less extreme examples. She has poems where 6 or 7 words have other possibilities, and the possibilities are running up on the margins all along the page. And what it gives you is maybe 16, 20, 25 different poems, possible poems, maybe more. So this is important to know that if you want to do a really in-depth study of Dickinson, you have to go to these handwritten fascicles here. Here's another one. I just want to read this. I won't be close reading it. They shut me up in prose, as when a little girl, they put me in the closet because they liked me still. Still, could themselves have peeped and seen my brain go round. They might as wise have lodged a bird for treason in the pound. Himself has but to will, and easy as a star, look down upon captivity and laugh. No more have I. Well, as you go to the E. Dickinson version, you see the plus sign here at the beginning of this line? Abolish his captivity. And it gives you a different poem here. Here's the possibility to replace look down upon with abolish his. Gives you a different line. So it's just how her mind works and just how her poems wanted to work. There was a computer guy, I think his name was Ted Nelson. He came up with this idea back when Microsoft Word was taking off for Xanadu, this intertextual kind of thing, that a program that doesn't imitate paper, but like makes this reimagining connection across all kinds of possibilities and associations. He's got a video on YouTube. It's really interesting. But I think I see Dickinson's poems as being a really great kind of experiment for that kind of thinking. Of course, the program didn't catch on, but he was onto something there. Now, there's a certain dramatic license that readers take up when they read the poem. And this is true for, plays by Shakespeare, for lyric poems. Depending on where you position the bodies on stage, what they're doing, where they're placing the emphasis, the meaning changes too. And this happens as we are reading. Our reading is our own performance of the lyric. And there are different ways by just adjusting the context of the poems. You change their meanings, or at least the tone sometimes. So when I taught this, I had 3 students. I asked one student, I said, please stand up. I had 3 really great readers, just really great performance on this. I asked my first student, I said, read this poem aloud as though the speaker is telling a story to a friend. And we heard it, and it was great. And I asked another student, I said, read this poem and, and read it like the speaker is alone after death, thinking aloud to herself and recalling a memory. And it was a little bit different, with different things done with the dashes. And then the third student, I said, well, I'll ask you to read this poem as though Emily is speaking alone to her God. And I'll read it aloud and pick one of those 3 scenarios. In fact, I will. I think I'm going to read it as Emily speaking alone to her God, and how that changes just our reading of it. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. But if you play it back in your own mind, you read it again in different ways, it changes how you read it. It changes how you imagine what Wendler called the antecedent scenario, what comes before this poem. It changes the way you think about the dashes, depending on in what context it's said. Now, Dickinson made this journey herself in 1886. She died of, they think, Blight's disease. It was something with perhaps the kidneys or the livers, or the liver. But it was 1886, so she was 56, too young. And at a time when the American world of letters was waiting for the American poet to arrive, little did they know that she was already here. In his 1870 essay in the Atlantic Monthly, Higginson wrote a really great essay. It criticized well-known poets of his day. Here we have it. He says, in looking out over any collection of American poetry, for instance, one is struck with the fact that it is not so much faulty as inadequate. Emerson set free the poetic intuition of America, Hawthorne its imagination. Both looked into the realm of passion. Emerson with distrust, Hawthorne with eager interest, but neither thrilled with its spell, and the American poet of passion is yet to come. When he's writing that essay, he has Emily Dickinson's letters in the drawer of his desk. He knows she's here, and he will be the one to reveal them to the world under her name. But it's like he's cognizant of the insufficiency of American poetry, at least in the area of passion. I think because he's had such an encounter with that in her poetry. Why didn't she want to publish? her friends, her family, who read the poems, they said, you have to give these to the world. It's selfish for you to hoard these. You need to publish them. And Sue actually, against her permission, published one of the poems. And Emily Dickinson wasn't very happy about that, obviously. She wrote to Higginson. She said, I smile when you suggest that I delay to publish, that being foreign to my mind as firmament is to fin. I think I think she wanted the world to read her poems. This is my personal opinion. But I think she didn't want to publish while she was still writing because it would have compromised the integrity of the poetic composition. I told my students, when you're writing your essays about literature, you have you have me or whoever's grading your paper kind of in the back of your imagination looking over the shoulder. And you're kind of imagining how the paper is going to be read by me. When you put it in your mind to publish something, or when you're writing something for somebody else, you have them in your head. She would have had the world in her bedroom. She would have had the world at her desk if she had put it in her mind to publish. And it would have changed the poems. These are highly confessional, highly intimate, personal. And were she to do that, it would have changed it. Now, why do I think that Dickinson was okay with us reading and doing what we're doing today with her poems? A few weeks before she died, I think it was about 6 weeks before she died, she had a sense that her illness was mortal. She wrote to Sue, Susan Gilbert Dickinson, whom she called Sue. She wrote, do you remember what whispered to Horatio? And my students had just read Hamlet about a month or two ago. Do you remember what whispered to Horatio? This was what was whispered to Horatio in Hamlet. Report me and my cause aright, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story. And you think, she did want to give us this because she knew she was done writing. So publication, I think, really would have compromised that. It really would have changed the way she composed, the way she thought about her own writing. It had to come from herself. Some of the poems she's writing to figures, she's writing to herself. Some of the poems I think she's writing just in the presence of God. There's something about it that's confessional in that sense. So I will end there. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll take some questions and we'll do some conversation here. Oh yeah, and before I leave, in the chat, Kitty says, she also said publication is the auction of the mind. Another great poem. So that's a good one to read in comparison to this whole idea.